So talking about utility and consumer theory, we want to take a look at as consumers consume more of any good or service, they receive benefit from that good or service. One thing that we see, as we talked about with our demand curve, is that that benefit is diminishing. It starts going down and sometimes it can even go negative. And so we want to take a look at that, what that looks like, and find out what's the best way for consumers to maximize their utility. So remember, just a quick definition of the word utility. Utility is really just the satisfaction that someone gets from consuming a good or consuming a service. And so let's take a little bit of a look at this graphically. We'll first start by talking about total utility. And so total utility is just the amount of benefit that someone gets, the total amount, from consuming some number. It could be 1, 2, 3, 4, 100, some number of a good. And so we're going to just have a hypothetical good here, and we're going to go ahead and graph out our total utility curve. And so if you notice, our total utility is rising, 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 and there does come a point where eventually we hit a maximum and it starts to go down. And so if we were to plot out these points, again, we have our coordinates there as well. So with a quantity of 0, obviously our total utility is 0 because we have not consumed any. But when we consume 1 of the product, our total utility or the total benefit we receive is 10. When we consume 2 of the product, the total utility we have is 18. 3 of the product, the total utility is 24, and so on. And that's all great, but one thing we need to make sure that we understand is the difference between total utility and marginal utility. Now, marginal utility is the extra benefit from consuming 1 more unit of a good. So remember, marginal is this word that really just means extra or additional. And so we want to understand, what is the extra benefit or the additional benefit received from getting 1 more, consuming 1 more of this product. Now, as we go through marginal utility, we are also going to plot this out, and then we'll kind of graph that out because it's important for us to look at marginal utility and this idea of diminishing marginal utility because, again, it is the basis for our demand curve. So again, when we look at marginal utility, we're trying to understand the additional benefit. So first, in moving from a quantity of 0 to a quantity of 1, if you notice, our total utility goes from 0 up to 10. And therefore, our additional or our marginal utility is 10 because we gain 10 more utils of benefit. But now going from 1 to 2, if you notice, going from 1 to 2, our total utility goes from 10 up to 18. And so the additional utility we receive from number 2, right? So the extra benefit from that second unit is 8. And so we can plot the point 8 right there because for that additional, that second unit, we get 8 more utils of benefit. Now going on to from 2 to 3, again, 18 to 24, that's 6 additional utils that we get there. From 3 to 4, we jump from 24 up to 28 of our total utility. And so that's a change of 4 or additional 4 units of utility, utils of utility. So we plot that, and then we keep going from 28 to 30, we get 2 more utils. And then from 5 to 6, if you notice, actually right there, our total utility stays the same. And what that means is from consuming a 6th unit, we gain no additional benefit. And so really the consumer is truly indifferent in consuming that 6th unit because there's nothing to be gained, but there's also nothing to be lost. Now, if you notice, when we make that turn from a quantity of 6 up to the 7th or that next unit, our total utility goes from 30 to 28. And so if you notice, that's actually a negative marginal utility. The extra benefit we get from consuming 1 more of a good is actually negative in that case. Now, if you notice, as we've plotted out all those marginal utility points as well, you notice that those are linear. If we plot those out, we see a downward curve. And that should make sense to us because we've talked before that with supply and demand, that the demand curve is downward sloping because of this idea of diminishing marginal utility. That for each additional unit of a good that we consume, we're going to receive less and less benefit or less and less utility. And so we can see that graphically right there with that blue line. Now, in maximizing utility, we often see that consumers are facing a budget constraint, meaning that they have to act within the restraints of their income or of a specific budget. And so when facing that budget, A consumer, we find, maximizes their benefit or maximizes their satisfaction when the last dollar spent on each product yields the same amount of marginal utility. And so this brings us to this idea of marginal utility per dollar. And that's actually what we see with our utility maximizing rule. Our utility maximizing rule is what we look at when we want to try to understand how much of each good, if we're comparing two goods, should a consumer consume when facing their budget constraint in order to maximize their utility to get the most utility they possibly can. And that rule says that the marginal utility of good A divided by the price of good A, which would be the marginal utility per dollar, should be equal to the marginal utility of B divided by the price of B, so the marginal utility of B. And we could extend this out for as many goods as we want, because that would also be equal to, or should be equal to, the marginal utility of C divided by the price of C, which should also be equal to the marginal utility of D divided by the price of D. It all depends on how many different goods or how many different options you're dealing with. But in order to maximize the total benefit or the total utility, those marginal utilities per dollar need to be equal. And so let's go ahead and take a look of an example of this. We're going to deal with bags of chips and 2 liters of soda. Now, just to kind of make things easy, we're going to assume that these are actually the same price of $2. But let's start off by looking at, let's say, just the total utility we receive from bags of chips. And so, that first bag gives us 16 utils, and then we go from there. And when we consume 2, we have a total utility of 28. 3 bags, it's a total utility of 36, and so on. Now, we can do the same thing for 2 liters of soda. Let's say that first 2 liter of soda gets us a total utility of 20. The second one, when we consume a total of 2 liters of soda, we have a total utility of 34. 3, it's a total utility of 44, and so on. And again, like we said, knowing total utility is great, but what that allows us to do then is to look at the marginal utility, which is going to be important for us, again, when trying to determine how to maximize our total utility. And so again, marginal utility is just the change in utility. And so we can just go through and look at the changes, from 0 to 16, it's 16. From 16 to 28, it's 12. From 28 to 36, it's 8, and so on. So there we have our marginal utility in utils for chips. And then we can do the same thing with soda. So from 0 to 20, it's 20. And then 20 to 34, it's 14. 34 to 44, it's 10, and so on. And then finally, in order to use that utility maximizing rule, we need to understand what is the marginal utility per dollar for each one of these different options, these different units for each additional unit. And so we start off with the bags of chips. For that first bag of chips, we get 16 additional utils there. And so we divide that by a price of 2, and we get 8. And then we do 12 divided by 2, and we get 6. We do marginal utility of 8 for the third bag of chips, so we get 4, and so on. And then we can do the same thing with our 2 liters. And so we have marginal utility of 20 for that first 2 liter. Divide that by $2, and we get a marginal utility per dollar of 10. The marginal utility for our second 2 liter is 14, and we divide that by 2, we get 7, and so on. Now let's suppose that because we're dealing with a budget constraint, let's say that our budget is $20. In which way would we maximize our utility? And so first of all, one thing that we can note is that if the price of everything is $2, that means we can consume a total of 10 units combined of chips and soda. And we want to understand what is going to give us the most utility. So let's just go ahead and throw out an option that might work. Let's say that we choose to consume 3 bags of chips and 7 2 liters of soda. That's what we choose to purchase. Now remember, we need to take a look at the marginal utility per dollar. And so starting with chips, we notice that the marginal utility for that third bag of chips is 8. And we would divide that by a price of $2. And that gives us that marginal utility per dollar of 4 that we can see there. And so we're good there. Let's take a look at soda, though. So for soda, we see that when we buy our 7th 2 liter, the marginal utility is 2. And we divide that by a price of 2. So that gives us a marginal utility per dollar of 1. And so if we compare these, for chips, we have a marginal utility per dollar of 4. For soda, we have a marginal utility per dollar of 1. If we look at this, what we're trying to determine, and maybe some of you have heard this term used before, is like what gives us more bang for our buck? Like which one gives us more benefit for the dollar we spend? Because we assume with consumer theory that we are rational and we are trying to maximize our utility. Well, if you notice, we're getting more utility per dollar when buying chips than buying soda. And therefore, moving forward, we should determine that, hey, we need to buy more chips. But let's take a look here because we're trying to determine about maximizing utility. If we were to add up the total utility we get at this combination, it would be 36 utils from chips in total, plus 64 in total from soda. So that's total utility of 100. But like we said, this indicates to us that since we're getting more bang for our buck from chips, right? We're getting more marginal utility per dollar from chips. We should start buying more chips. So let's say that we buy an additional bag of chips. So let's say when making our decision the next time, we choose to buy a fourth bag of chips. Now, again, if we buy a fourth bag of chips, 4 bags of chips and 7 2-liters of soda, that's $22, and we don't have that amount of money, and therefore we would have to buy less soda. So instead of buying 7, we're only going to be able to buy 6 2-liters of soda. But now again, we want to compare the marginal utility per dollar of chips and soda now. So now for chips, we see that we have a marginal utility of 4. So because we're now buying more chips, our marginal utility has decreased for that fourth bag because of that rule of diminishing marginal utility, right? The third bag gave us 8 additional utils. The fourth bag only gives us 4. And so we see that our marginal utility is decreasing here, which means our marginal utility per dollar is decreasing. Our marginal utility per dollar is only 2 now. But let's take a look at soda. Because before with soda, we had a marginal utility of 2, so we had a marginal utility per dollar of 1 because 2 divided by 2 is 1. But now that we're buying less soda, we're kind of going the other direction on the idea of diminishing marginal utility. And so we actually see that the marginal utility for our 6th 2-liter of soda is greater than the marginal utility for our 7th 2-liter. And so we see that we have a marginal utility of 4 for that 6th 2-liter of soda divided by the price of soda, $2, which gives us a marginal utility per dollar of 2. And if we notice here, the marginal utility per dollar is now equal. And this is our utility maximizing rule. Now again, in order to prove that this does in fact maximize our utility, we need to check. And so we can add up the total utility, and we find that the total utility from buying those 4 bags of chips is going to be 40, plus the total utility from buying those 6 2-liters of soda, which is 62, and that gives us a total utility of 102. And so in fact, we have gotten more utility than our previous option. And you can even check this against all the rest of the options. Like suppose that we decided to buy 5 of each, 5 bags of chips and 5 2-liters of soda. Well, if you notice, that'd be a total utility of 42 from chips and 58 from soda, and that's once again 100. And so we never have any other combination that reaches a total utility of 102. That is our highest maximum utility, and that happens there because that's at the point where our marginal utilities per dollar are equal for each of our goods.